The wind rolled off the prairie with a low whistle, stirring the dust that clung stubbornly to the wooden boards of the ghost town saloon. A tumbleweed skipped across the empty main street, bouncing gently past the shuttered storefronts, until it came to rest at the hooves of a weathered palomino. The horse stood motionless, reins dragging in the dust, its golden coat dulled by time and grit. Its ears twitched at the wind's whisper, but its eyes, dark, watchful, never left the porch of the small house at the edge of town. Inside, the old cowboy lay still on his narrow bed, breath shallow and distant. His name was Eli Dawson, though few called him that anymore. Most just said Old Eli, with a kind of reverence, like he was a monument to something long past. His room smelled faintly of saddle soap, pipe smoke, and dry hay. A life lived close to the earth. His Stetson hung on a rusted nail above the bed frame. His boots, worn to the shape of his bones, stood like sentinels beside him. He hadn't spoken much in the last week. The town doctor, young, polite, and always looking out of place in this forgotten corner of the world, had said Eli's heart was giving out. Like a lantern burning on the last wick, he'd said, and everyone nodded like they understood, even if none of them really wanted to. Only one visitor came every day without fail. Not a person, a horse. The same palomino that now stood outside in the wind, watching. His name was Buckshot. No one quite knew how old Buckshot was. Some folks said he'd been around since Eli was still breaking broncs and winning rodeos. Others whispered the horse had outlived 2 generations of riders. But what everyone did know was that the bond between Eli and Buckshot ran deeper than blood. They'd been seen riding together before sunrise, back when Eli could still mount without groaning, before his knees turned to rust. They rode in silence, cutting across the hills, like spirits of the land. No reins, no saddle some days. Just trust. A faint cough rattled in Eli's throat. He blinked toward the window, eyes struggling to focus on the silhouette beyond the curtain. He knew Buckshot was out there. He always was. Eli had once been the heart of this town. When the rail line closed down and families packed up and moved east, Eli stayed. When the schoolhouse shut its doors and weeds climbed the fences, he stayed. When even the post office stopped delivering mail, he still stayed. "This land remembers," he used to say, "and I reckon I owe it to remember back." But now he was forgetting faces, years, sometimes even where he was. The only thing that stayed clear was Buckshot. The townsfolk, the few who remained, respected the old man. They brought him meals and wood, nodded solemnly when they passed him on the dirt road, but they kept their distance. It wasn't out of unkindness. It was because Eli belonged to another time, a time when men rode with purpose and horses weren't pets, but partners. That morning, as the sun rose and painted the sky in dusty pinks and oranges, Buckshot moved to the porch and waited. He didn't make noise. He didn't paw or nicker. He simply waited. Inside, Eli stirred. His fingers trembled as they reached for the small drawer beside the bed. Inside it was a faded photograph, cracked at the corners and curled with age. It showed a younger Eli, no more than 30, standing beside a proud, broad-chested palomino. Both of them looked untamed, alive. He touched the photo lightly, his rough fingers trembling over the edges. "We were something, weren't we?" he whispered. His voice was barely there, like wind in dry grass. He closed his eyes again, breath catching. Outside, Buckshot lowered his head. Later that morning, as the sun climbed higher and cast long shadows from the fence posts, Sheriff Lane arrived. He was a middle-aged man with a kind face and a belly that hinted at too many years behind a desk. He stepped up to the porch and tipped his hat toward the horse. "Morning, Buckshot," he said quietly, as if speaking too loud might unsettle something sacred. He knocked gently on the door. No answer. He waited, then pushed it open. The house was silent, a kind of silence that filled your ears like water. Eli lay exactly as he had the day before, only this time there was no rise in his chest, no twitch of the fingers. Lane stood there for a long while, hat in hand, before finally crossing the room and resting 2 fingers on the old man's wrist. Nothing. He exhaled, a long sigh that carried more than just air. It carried years. The sheriff stepped back out and looked at Buckshot. The horse didn't flinch, didn't move, just stared. "I guess you already knew," Lane murmured. By noon, the town had gathered. A small town meant small numbers, maybe 12 folks in total. They stood in a quiet half-circle outside Eli's home. Some bowed their heads. Others stared at their boots. A couple of children clung to their mother's skirts, wide-eyed and unsure why the grown-ups looked so solemn. The preacher, a man with sun-beaten skin and hands like stone, said a few words, simple ones, about loyalty, about time, about how some souls ride a little farther than others. But it was Buckshot who held their gaze. He hadn't moved once. When the preacher finished, a hush settled. No one really knew what to do next. They hadn't planned this far. Then Buckshot stepped forward. The crowd parted without thinking. The horse walked with slow, heavy steps up the porch, into the open doorway, and stood beside the bed. He didn't sniff. He didn't make a sound. He lowered his head to Eli's chest, and stayed like that for a long, long time. No one moved. No one dared. And when he finally backed away, turning toward the open street, something in his eyes, something deep, grieving, but proud, held the town in its grip. The horse stepped down from the porch and started walking, not aimlessly, with purpose, toward the open land beyond the last fence, toward the hills he and Eli had once conquered together. He didn't look back, and no one followed. Not yet, but hearts stirred. Something had begun, and the silence he left behind was heavier than before, heavier, and full of meaning. The road leading out of town was little more than 2 faded wagon ruts, winding into the scrub-covered hills like a memory trying not to be forgotten. Buckshot walked that road alone, his gait slow, deliberate, as though every step was a conversation with the past. The townsfolk watched from a distance, none daring to interrupt. Something sacred had been set in motion, and to interfere would have felt like speaking in a cathedral during prayer. A mile outside town, where the grass grew high and the earth held the warmth of 1,000 sunsets, Buckshot stopped. He stood on a rise overlooking a dry creek bed, the place where Eli used to take him at dusk. The cowboy had once told the sheriff long ago, "This is where the world gets quiet enough to remember." Buckshot seemed to recall that too. He stayed there, unmoving, for hours, ears tilted to the wind, eyes distant. Back in town, the weight of Eli's passing settled like dust on the windowsills. There was no formal announcement, no printed obituary, just the empty chair on his porch, and the horse no longer tied out front. Yet word spread, as things did in small towns, not by declaration, but by the knowing looks exchanged across shop counters and the silence that replaced casual greetings. Sheriff Lane sat behind his desk, staring at the photograph he'd pulled from Eli's drawer. It showed the old man at his prime, hand on Buckshot's bridle, both of them looking like they could outrun time. Lane ran a thumb along the bottom edge, where Eli had once scrawled in pencil, "The day we outran the storm." Lane didn't know what storm Eli had meant, weather or something deeper, maybe both. Across from him sat Mara. She was Eli's niece, a woman in her 30s with sharp eyes and a quiet strength inherited from her uncle. She'd come in from Cheyenne the morning after he passed, driving a dusty truck that smelled of hay and long roads. She hadn't cried, not in front of anyone, but Lane could see something breaking behind her eyes. "He didn't leave a will," she said, her voice even but low. "Just a few notes in that old ledger. No money to speak of, barely enough to bury him." Lane nodded. That horse meant everything to him. Mara looked toward the window, where the horizon stretched, empty and endless. "He used to write me letters about Buckshot. Said the horse was smarter than most men. Wasn't wrong." She leaned forward. "Sheriff, do you think he knew he was dying?" Lane thought for a moment. "I think Eli's known for a long time. Just didn't see any reason to make a fuss." There was a pause, the kind that feels full, not empty. "I want to find him," Mara said. "Buckshot, I mean. Bring him home. He shouldn't be out there alone." Lane's eyebrows lifted. "You know he won't come easy. That horse only listened to Eli." "I'm not trying to tame him," she said. "I just want him to know someone's still here." 2 days later, Mara set out on horseback, riding a borrowed mare with a steady pace and patient eyes. She carried a blanket, a saddlebag with oats, and one of Eli's old flannel shirts. It still smelled faintly of tobacco and leather. She didn't have a plan, just a direction. West, where the hills rose like old bones, and the wind spoke in Eli's voice if you listened hard enough. By evening, she found signs. Hoof prints near the dried creek. Grass bent from where a horse had laid down. She dismounted and crouched low, tracing the marks with her fingers like a tracker from an older time. Her uncle had taught her that once, how to read the land like a story. She followed the trail until the sky turned purple with dusk. Then, as stars began to blink awake, she saw him. Buckshot stood on a ridge, silhouetted against the twilight. He didn't run. He didn't even move. Just watched her, head slightly tilted. Mara stepped forward slowly, heart thudding. "Hey, boy," she whispered, holding out Eli's shirt. "Remember this?" Buckshot flicked his ears. The wind caught the flannel and blew it gently toward him. He lowered his head, sniffed once, and took a step closer. She didn't try to touch him. Not yet. She just sat down on the ground, cross-legged, and waited. The stars turned overhead. Coyotes yipped somewhere in the distance. Buckshot remained, eyes fixed on her. When morning came, she was still there. And so was he. Over the next few days, Mara returned to the same spot, bringing oats and pieces of apple. She didn't try to rope him or guide him back. Instead, she read aloud from one of Eli's journals, her voice carrying through the cool morning air. She told the stories he'd written, about their first ride, their longest trail, the time Buckshot had spooked and thrown him into a cactus patch, and how they'd both laughed later around a campfire. The horse listened. One evening, just as the sun dipped low, painting the hills in amber light, Buckshot walked up to her and rested his muzzle against her shoulder. She didn't cry, not until he sighed, deep and low, the sound of something ancient letting go. That night, she rode back toward town with Buckshot walking beside her, untethered. The next morning, they reached the fence line. The townsfolk were gathered, unspoken but expected, watching from a distance as Mara and the horse approached. Something in Buckshot had shifted. He no longer carried the stiffness of grief alone. Something had eased. She led him to Eli's grave, freshly marked with a wooden cross and a small bouquet of prairie flowers. Buckshot stepped up to it, lowered his head, and stood there without command. It was then, as the wind carried the scent of spring over the hills, that Mara felt something break open inside her. Not grief, but continuity. A thread tying her back to where she came from, to the quiet resilience that her uncle had embodied, and that this horse now carried forward. The town watched in silence. Something had returned, but something else was stirring. A sense that the story wasn't finished yet, that this bond, newly forged in loss, still had miles left to ride. And in Buckshot's steady eyes, Mara saw not just memory, but invitation. The days that followed fell into a rhythm, quiet, steady, and full of something deeper than routine. Mara stayed in Eli's old cabin, sweeping out the dust, patching holes in the roof, and sorting through drawers cluttered with relics of a long, quiet life. Buckshot stayed close by, not tied, not penned, just there, hovering near the porch like a ghost that had decided to stay. Mornings began with the creak of floorboards and the smell of black coffee. Mara took to reading more of Eli's journals, each page filled with looping cursive and the occasional smudge of dirt or sweat. They weren't stories, not really. More like conversations he'd had with himself. Notes on the land, thoughts about the sky, memories of people who drifted through and left just enough behind to be remembered. And always, there was Buckshot. "He's not just a horse," Eli had written once. "He's the only one who ever stayed long enough to understand me." Mara understood now. She spent her afternoons walking the pasture, speaking softly to Buckshot as he grazed. She told him about her life in the city, the teaching job she didn't love, the apartment that never quite felt like home. Buckshot never answered, but his presence was constant, anchoring her in a way that silence never had before. At night, when the wind pressed against the cabin walls and the stars crowded the sky, Mara would sit on the porch wrapped in a quilt that smelled faintly of cedar. Buckshot would stand at the edge of the yard, ears twitching toward every whisper of wind. Sometimes he'd approach, stand close, and lower his head to rest against her knee. It was a gesture of trust, of mourning, of quiet companionship, but something gnawed at the edge of peace, a tension in the town that hadn't yet found its voice. People came by, offering condolences and polite smiles, but Mara sensed the undercurrent. Whispers that Buckshot should be sold, put to use, or at least fenced in, that he was too valuable to be left, wandering like a stray dog with hooves. Sheriff Lane came to see her one morning. He parked his dusty truck under the cottonwood and knocked gently on the screen door. "I hear talk," he said without preamble. "There's interest in that horse. Real interest." Mara folded her arms. "He's not for sale." Lane sighed and leaned against the porch post. "I know that. You know that. But others don't see it that way. They see a legacy, a prize, something worth owning." "He's not a trophy," she said firmly. "I agree. But there's a man from Silver Creek, big ranch, deep pockets. Says he knew Eli once. Claims there was a handshake deal. Wants to cash it in." Mara's jaw tightened. Eli would have never promised Buckshot to anyone. "I believe you. But without a will, without proof, these folks think they can muscle in." That evening, as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the pasture, Mara found Buckshot by the old fence line. She leaned against the wood, arms draped over the top rail. "They think they can take you," she said softly. "They think grief makes people weak." Buckshot flicked his tail, his head rising at the tone of her voice. "I'm not giving you up," she said. "You're not something that can be bought. You're Eli's. And now, maybe you're mine too." The horse stepped closer, nose brushing against her sleeve. She didn't flinch. Later that night, a noise outside woke her. Hooves. Fast. Urgent. She slipped from her bed and rushed to the door. Buckshot was pacing the yard, agitated, nostrils flared. A truck engine faded into the distance, and Mara's heart dropped. She ran to the barn. The back gate was open. The saddle Eli had used for 20 years was gone. And so were the journals. The violation was more than theft. It was desecration. In the morning, Lane came again, this time with a grim look and dirt on his boots. "They broke into the barn," she told him before he could speak. "Took the saddle. The journals. Maybe more." He nodded. Same truck was seen heading west out of town, just before dawn. Could be the same man from Silver Creek. Could be someone local trying to stir things up. Mara's hands curled into fists. "We need to get them back." "We will," Lane said. "But you need to be careful. This isn't just about a horse anymore. It's about what he represents. People are starting to see him as a symbol of freedom, of legend, of ownership. That makes him dangerous to the wrong people." That night, Mara stayed close to Buckshot. She slept outside, wrapped in Eli's quilt, the rifle by her side. She wasn't afraid, but she was ready. Buckshot lay beside her, not touching, but near enough that she could hear his breath. "He trusted you," she whispered into the dark. "And I do, too." As the wind passed through the trees and coyotes called from the hills, she felt something settle inside her, a conviction of fire. This wasn't just about a horse. It was about protecting what mattered, about honoring a promise made in silence. And as dawn stretched its fingers across the land, painting the world in gold, Mara rose to her feet. Buckshot rose too. Together, they looked west, toward whatever came next. Mara rode bareback at dawn. The wind whipped her hair behind her. Her hands gripped the coarse strands of Buckshot's mane, and her legs tightened instinctively against his sides. It was the first time she had ever ridden him. No saddle, no bit, only trust. Buckshot didn't resist. He surged forward like he'd been waiting for this moment, hooves thundering against the hard earth, mane wild and free. She didn't know where she was going exactly, only that she had to follow the trail the sheriff mentioned, the one leading west. They reached the ridge by mid-morning. The valley spread out below like a map of memory. Dust curled along the old cattle trail, too fresh to be wind-blown. Mara scanned the horizon until she saw the black pickup parked beneath the twisted oak near the river bend. She didn't hesitate. Buckshot descended the slope with practiced precision, his body tense but certain. When they reached the clearing, the man standing by the truck turned slowly, as if he already knew who was coming. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with silver streaking his beard and a rifle resting against his tailgate. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You must be the niece," he said, voice gravelly. "Didn't think you'd come yourself." "Where are Eli's things?" she demanded, sliding off Buckshot's back, but keeping him close. "In the truck, safe and sound." He didn't move. "You don't look like much of a horsewoman." "Looks can be deceiving," she said. "You stole from me." "I reclaimed a promise," the man said, lifting his chin. "Your uncle owed me. That horse, that saddle, they were part of a deal he never had the guts to finish." "Eli never mentioned you." "Because he was ashamed. We served together, long time ago. After the war, we went separate ways, but he promised, if anything happened, Buckshot would be mine." "That's a lie. It's the truth as I see it." Mara stepped forward. Buckshot moved with her, ears forward, body alert. "You came like a thief in the night," she said. "You don't deserve to speak his name." The man's eyes narrowed. "And what are you going to do about it?" In answer, Mara reached behind her and pulled out the folded sheet of paper she had tucked into her coat. Sheriff Lane had found it wedged in Eli's last journal, nearly missed in the margins of a final entry. It wasn't official, not notarized, but it was written in Eli's hand and signed with a date. "If anything happens to me, Mara gets the land. And Buckshot, too. He'd never forgive me otherwise." She handed the note to the man. He read it slowly. When he looked back up, his jaw was clenched. "You think that piece of paper changes anything?" "It's enough," Mara said. "And you know it." He didn't argue. Instead, he turned, opened the truck, and pulled out the saddle and the bundle of journals wrapped in a red feed sack. He set them on the ground between them. "Take it," he said flatly. Mara stepped forward, gathered them up, and walked back to Buckshot. She slung the saddle over his back, not to ride, but to carry. The journals she held to her chest. "You got fire," the man muttered. "Just like your uncle. He always did pick the stubborn ones." "He picked right," Mara replied. She mounted again, nodding once before turning Buckshot back toward the ridge. They didn't look back. The ride home was quiet. The sun was higher now, casting long shadows that danced across the hills. Mara didn't speak. Neither did Buckshot. But something had changed between them, something permanent. When they returned to the ranch, Sheriff Lane was waiting. He tipped his hat when he saw her and offered a tired smile. "He give you trouble?" "Not much," she said, handing over the journals. "Here's the proof you need." Lane leafed through the pages and whistled low. "Eli wrote down everything, didn't he? He always talked more when no one was around." Lane nodded. "Town's been talking. Some folks are saying what Buckshot did at the funeral, they've never seen anything like it. Others are saying the horse should be put in a museum." "He's not going anywhere," Mara said. "Not unless he chooses to." "You staying?" Mara looked out across the land, the wind ruffling the tall grass, the barn standing crooked and worn but full of memory. "I think I am." Lane nodded again. "You ever need anything, I'll holler." After he left, Mara turned Buckshot loose in the pasture. He galloped once around, as if reclaiming his place, before settling beneath the willow tree where Eli used to sit. Mara walked to the porch, sat on the old swing, and opened one of the journals. She read for hours, the sun creeping toward the horizon, page after page of thoughts, regrets, stories left untold. One entry stood out. "I think I've lived most of my life in silence. But Buckshot, he heard it all anyway. Maybe someday someone will read this and understand what I couldn't say out loud." Tears slid down Mara's cheeks. She closed the book and looked toward the pasture. Buckshot was standing at the fence now, watching her like he knew she'd just found something she hadn't known was lost. That night, the town held a gathering in the square to honor Eli. It wasn't planned. People just started showing up with candles and memories. Mara spoke only once, her voice steady and clear. "He died in silence," she said. "But his horse, spoke for him." The crowd was hushed. No one questioned her words. From then on, Buckshot roamed the town freely. He visited the post office, stood at the window of the diner until someone brought out a biscuit, and waited outside the schoolhouse some mornings, watching the children laugh. People began to say that Eli never left. Not really. He just changed shape. Mara repaired the barn, planted wildflowers around the property, and hosted kids from the town to learn about horses and the land. Buckshot became the heart of it all, part guardian, part ghost, part living memory. And though he never wore the saddle again, it stayed on a rack in the barn, oiled and polished, as a symbol of everything they had lost and everything they had found again. Mara never stopped reading the journals. Each one revealed a little more of the man behind the silence. And each time she looked into Buckshot's eyes, she knew. Eli had poured everything he was into that horse, and that horse had chosen to stay behind for her, not to haunt the past, but to guide her into whatever came next. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that stay with you long after they end. See you in the next one.